нашем следующем выступлении, друзья, профессор Шина.
So, our next talk will be about the influence of the selection of cognitive functions. So, how can we train our innovative mind and about our own innovative methods? So, think on a larger scale. This is Sheena Iyengar. She's a professor of business on the Department of Management, Columbia University, rating Thinker 50. Please.
Professor Iyengar, please.
Professor Iyengar, please, you take the floor.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here today and including me as part of your very special event. So, as she just mentioned just now, I have been developing a new method for how to come up with our biggest and best ideas. If there's one thing we've all become really cognizant of in the last 2 years is how important it is to know how to problem solve. And until now, the only real tool we've ever been given for how to come up with ideas is something we call brainstorming. Brainstorming was invented in 1938, and despite all the talk we have on innovation, we actually have not innovated on innovation since 1938. So it's time for us to use knowledge that we've gained from our experiences and from science, particularly neuroscience, cognitive science, to help us become better at coming up with good ideas for complex problems. So today I'm going to walk you through a method that I have been creating for the past 7 years that comes out of my research on choice, but also adds to that the research that's come out of neuroscience in the last 2 decades, and offers you a new tool for how to come up with our best ideas. Overall, the method is called Think Bigger, and the book will be coming out next year in spring of 2022 by the same name, Think Bigger. So let's get started. Take a look at this lady here. Do you know who she is? Do you know what she stands for? She is, of course, the Statue of Liberty that stands in the harbor of New York City, at the gateway of Manhattan. Now, let me tell you what she stands for, and I'm going to play a poem by Emma Lazarus, who tells us what she means.
Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land. Here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor, that Twin Cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my light beside the golden door. Emma Lazarus.
The Statue of Liberty is recognizable to people from all across the globe. And if you think about it, what is she? Is she just a statue? She is actually quite a big statue. She weighs about 225 tons, and she's about 93 meters tall. And to get to the top, you have to climb about 162 steps. But there's lots of statues that are big like that. So she's more than just a statue. Is she just happens to be a very famous statue because she stands at the gateway to Manhattan, one of the major cities of the United States, or some might say the major city of the United States? Well, I'm sure that helps, but we have lots of great statues around the world, which are in famous locations, and yet somehow they don't have quite the magic that Lady Liberty has. I want to argue to you that Lady Liberty is more than a statue, that what Lady Liberty is a big idea. She's a big idea because she doesn't just stand for the substance and content of the artwork. She's more than that. What she stands for is an idea. And that idea is something that means something special to all of us as individuals. Every single person that sees Lady Liberty has a reaction to her. It's as if she becomes theirs. Lady Liberty means something to us as nations, as people bound together across the globe. As Emma Lazarus put it, she gave voice to this statue and made it a big idea by linking the statue to such important concepts as freedom, liberty, hope, dreaming for a better life, a sense of welcome. This is the place you can come and be whoever you want to be. Now, of course, the statue itself doesn't say any of those things. It's our interpretation. It's what she's come to mean to us. And I can tell you, as someone who loves to bike along Riverside Drive in Manhattan, my target when I go for an early morning bike ride is always to get to Lady Liberty. Because somehow, if you get to Lady Liberty just as the sun is rising, that means that whatever dream you had will come true. So here's my question to you today. Where do we get big ideas? Where does the idea of a Lady Liberty actually come from? The artist who made Lady Liberty, the sculptor, was a Frenchman by the name of Frédéric Bartholdi. As some of you may recall, Lady Liberty was a gift given to us by France in honor of the 100th anniversary of democracy and freedom in the United States. So it was given to us around shortly after 1876. Well, where did Frédéric Bartholdi, who lived all the way over there in France, get the idea of Lady Liberty? Besides, there's been lots of monuments to lots of things, and they're not quite as universally recognized. Well, let me tell you a little bit about the story of Frédéric Bartholdi himself. He was born in France. His father was a builder. Turned out his father died when he was 2 years old, so his mother brought him to Paris. The most important family member in his life as an only child was his mother. So he grows up in Paris, and at first he's very enamored of architecture. And then suddenly he discovers his passion in sculpting. In fact, when he was in his early 20s, he won an award for making a sculpture of a Good Samaritan, and as a result was sent to Egypt with a whole bunch of other people. And there in Egypt, he was inspired. He loved those colossal monuments guarding the ancient Egyptian tombs. And so later on, when he was back in Paris and there was a request to get drawings of potential sculptures that might guard the Suez Canal, that might be a part of the Suez Canal, he decided to create a drawing of a colossal female statue wearing robes, carrying a light, the light to Asia, he thought. But he was declined. They rejected his proposal. So here he was in France, all rejected, didn't know what to do. And he comes across a friend of his by the name of Edouard Le Boulet. Well, Edouard was a guy who believed in freedom, was very disappointed in the fact that France, he felt, was going in a wrong direction back then. Remember, this is the time of Bonaparte. And so he wanted to somehow restore people's faith in freedom. So he had this idea that, well, what if we were to give a gesture to the United States in honor of their 100th year centennial, and in the process restore faith and democracy, not just in the US, but more importantly for him in France. And so he began to come up with this idea of a statue, and it just so happened that Bartholdi was one of his dear friends. And so he asked Bartholdi if he would help him. And to make the long story short, as time went on, it turned out that this is probably the first example of crowdfunding, because in fact, he couldn't get money from the French government to build this statue. It was done by everyday people who pulled together money. And then it took about 16 years where Edward Bartholdi, little by little, builds the Lady Liberty. And he brings it to the United States. And again, they had to do crowdfunding to build the pedestal on which she stands today. Okay, so when you hear me tell that story to you, you think to yourself, yeah, it's consistent with everything I know about how do you come up with a big idea. You're supposed to be the kind of person who's passionate about your dreams, who's got an ideal. And when you've got some ideal, you persist and you persist until you finally make it. We love those stories. They're called the hero's journey. What's the other kind of story that you don't maybe see Disney movies about, but you certainly see in your everyday life is the sort of practical reality of innovating. You know, you happen to have a friend and they happen to have a need. And so therefore you happen to be the right person at the right time and are therefore able to take advantage of it. Now, if you look at the story of Frederick Bartholdi, you can certainly tell his story in both ways. He was an idealist. He was a pragmatist. He shifted his dream from building a statue in the Suez Canal to building a statue in New York, according to practical circumstances. But you know what? Regardless of whether you believe he was an idealist or a pragmatist, regardless of whether you believe that one or both of these is really important, by the way, they're both important, they don't answer the question, where did he get the idea? They tell you something about the mindset you should have, but they don't tell you how to get the idea. And most theories right now on innovation only tell you about the mindset. They don't tell you how to get the idea. How did he get the idea? Well, let's look at Lady Liberty. I already told you that he was inspired by the colossal images guarding the Egyptian tombs. Notice how big Lady Liberty is. Well, what about the pose? At that time, when he was building the statue, there was a very famous painting in the museums of Paris by Lefebvre called La Vérité, the Lady of Truth. Notice the likeness. Notice the pose. Notice how her hand grips the thing in her hand. Okay? Well, but this is not the Lady of Truth, right? This is the Lady of Liberty. What about the image of Libertas, and in particular that crown? It turned out that at that moment in France, they were actually printing coins with Libertas on it, the Roman goddess. Notice the likeness to the crown. But what about the face, that inscrutable face of Lady Liberty that's at once warm, but yet not so easy to connect to exactly? Where does that face come from? Well, as I said earlier, the most important person in Frederick Bartholdi's life was his mother. And that face was the face of his mother. So let's put these pieces together. What do you have? The ancient Egyptian tombs plus the coin plus Lady of Truth plus his mother. Voila, you have Lady Liberty. And as I show you that these are the pieces that were combined together to make Lady Liberty, you completely see what I am saying and you believe me. And yet you would say to me, no, but she's more than that. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And indeed she is. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. But here's my point. Innovation is nothing more and nothing less than a useful, novel combination of old ideas that come together to solve for a complex problem. And that complex problem can exist in the space of art or in the space of business or science or wherever. It's always a combination. I'm going to give you another business example that is just as much of a big idea, just as much of a revolutionary concept around the world as Lady Liberty. Let's take the car. Who made the car universal? A man by the name of Henry Ford. We often credit him as the man behind the assembly line, right? He didn't actually invent the assembly line, by the way. The assembly line was already being used by Oldsmobile at that time, the leading car producer. So Ford didn't invent the car either. What did Ford do exactly? Well, he decided to define his problem in a very important way. The car existed, but it was very expensive back then. It could cost about $2,000, which back then in the early 1900s was actually a lot of money. So he's asked the question, how do we make a car that is affordable? And he broke it down. He said, well, what are the things that make it so hard to make it affordable? Well, it takes too much time to make. The materials cost too much. Also, the labor costs are very high. So he went out and looked around. How do I solve each of these little problems or important parts of the problem? And he said, okay, well, how do I reduce the cost of labor? There was something already being used by Oldsmobile called the assembly line that reduced the cost of labor. Different people do different parts, so you only have to train them the small specialized thing that they do. They do that one thing, and so therefore they don't have to be as specialized. They just need to know how to do one thing. And then also you can get them to do that one thing over and over and over again, so there's less error and they can speed it up. Well, what about the time? It still took a lot of time. It took an average of 12.5 hours to make a car back then. Well, what Henry Ford discovered was when he went to other industries that had a similar problem, which at that time was the slaughterhouses of Chicago, what he discovered was they had a rather unique method for reducing the time. They called it the disassembly line. And what the disassembly line used to do was it would move the animal from people to people, meaning from different workers to different workers. And as the meat is moving, they take the various parts off. And that reduced the time. Well, what if we created a moving assembly line in the car industry? Remember back then in Oldsmobile, it was not a moving assembly line, it was just an assembly line. The car came to the people, so that took time to keep moving the car. So if you now created a moving assembly line, you now reduce the amount of time it took to build a car from 12.5 hours to 1.5 hours. Now, what about the cost of the materials? The cost of the materials He also found a way to reduce that by finding a brand new painting mechanism called Japanning. And what did Japanning do? It would help you have your car in any color you wanted. Henry Ford was famous for saying, as long as it was black. And that was because if you use that kind of paint, it would dry in about 24 hours to 48 hours, which was about a third less time than the average paint color took back then. Okay, so notice in these two examples, what am I pointing out? That innovation is a combination of ideas. And now what I'm showing you in the case of Henry Ford is it's important to take a problem, define it, break it down, and then find ways in which others have solved the problem, and you find tactics for solving the problem in your industry, of course, like the assembly line, but really, really important to look out of your industry and find tactics that work in other industries. Out of the box. You know, they often tell us to think out of the box, and then we wait for magic to happen so that we can do out of the box thinking, because they never tell you how to think out of the box. The way you think out of the box is by finding examples of strategies that worked in other industries. So what is the mystery behind coming up with new ideas? How do you find and create these combinations? Well, we now know the answer to that from neuroscience. As Eric Kandel reminded us in his Nobel Prize winning speech, he said that who we are is just a matter of what we've learned and what we have in our memory banks. That's who we are. So let's think about how we create thoughts. We walk around life with our brains kind of like a library system where we have different shelves of information. And so every time I ask you a question, you think about that question and you figure out which shelf in my memory bank, my library system, do I have bits of information. I retrieve those and I make a connection. And then I say, voila, here's my thought. And some of those are really easy for us to do because we've done them so many times. For example, let me show you this question. If I were to say, what is 28 plus 32? You would naturally all say, well, 60. Now, if I show you this math problem, you're probably looking at it and like, huh? By the way, the answer is the same, but you would only know it if you knew ancient Greek. Now, that might seem like an analytical problem that has nothing to do with creativity, but in fact, your brain is working exactly the same way when you're doing an analytical task or a creative task. So, for example, if I ask you, what are some words that rhyme with airplane, but that aren't real words? Tropane, copain, stain. You might come up with all kinds of words. You're doing exactly the same thing as you did when you added 28 plus 32. So, how does our brain come up with ideas? We connect different bits in our heads, and if they happen to be accessible to us, we'll connect it. And if they happen not to be accessible to us, we won't. So I believe that given what we know about how our brain works and creates ideas, we can actually create a tool that helps us create our best ideas rather than waiting for chance to seemingly help us connect these random bits in our heads. So I'm going to show you a tool that I created, which I have now taught this to thousands of students here at the Columbia Business School, called the Choice Map. So here's what the choice map is. At the top, you define your problem, like how do I make an accessible, affordable car? And you break it down into its most meaningful subparts. How do I reduce, say, labor costs, time that it takes to make it, cost of materials, etc. Whatever you fill in, what are the most important parts of the problem that have to be solved for? And now, in each row, you first identify the best practice within your industry, and then you go to other industries that are analogous but have nothing to do with your industry to see how they solved that conceptual problem. And then you take one piece, one strategy per row, and you line them up in your brain and you say, what could I create? That's what I call choice mapping. So what is a choice map? It gives you lots of choices, but relevant choices. They're all useful. And what is choice mapping is when you start to create different connections between your choices and come up with as many different combinations as you can until you find one you like that actually feels right. Because just as Roger Martin said earlier today, there's the analytical part, which is what the choice map is, but then there's that intuitive part. And so it's when you create these combinations that you start to say, oh, well, you know what? That combination feels better to me than this other one. And that's the sort of intuition part. And that's how you can use intuition in a way that complements your analytics, as opposed to potentially putting you in danger of engaging in biases. Okay, so I know I'm running out of time, but I want to just walk you through one example. So let's imagine, and this is a fake, I created this, so this product does not exist. I'm just using this to give you an idea, a way to work this. So let's imagine I had a problem which said, I want to help the environment. How do I reduce the amount of plastic pollution in the city of New York? Let's imagine that was my problem. Too big. So now you break it down and you say, well, okay, I'm going to say, how do I reduce the number of plastic bags in New York City? Because after all, plastic bags is a really big part of plastic pollution. So first I'm going to say, well, but why do I have plastic bags? Like, what's the purpose? There's a reason why we have plastic bags. I can't just suddenly, reduce them. And in fact, plastic bags are very useful, right? They serve all kinds of purposes. They're very convenient to carry. I can carry all kinds of things, perishables. I can use them for, many different things and carry things, and it'll also stay dry. All right. Well, as I look at all these uses, I realize that the real problem I want to solve is, how do I create a sustainable alternative to the plastic bag? Okay. Now, if I break it down, I say, well, what are the things that this bag must be to work? Well, it has to be versatile, it has to be sturdy, and it has to be easy to carry. Otherwise, it's just not going to be replaced. It's not going to be a legitimate replacement for the plastic bag. So notice how in each row, I have an within industry and an out of industry example, right? So for versatile, I have the polythene bag, very common bag, but then I have the Instant Pot, right? Completely out of domain. You can use that to cook all kinds of stuff. Okay, now let's look at sturdy. I have the dome tar bag. Then I also have the dog carrier, very sturdy. Okay, easy to carry. I have the Chico bag within industry, but then I have the inverted umbrella. Oh, that's easy to carry, isn't it? They found an interesting solution. Now let's imagine I were to start combining. Okay, let's just take one sample combination. I'm going to take the Instant Pot plus the dome tar bag plus the inverted umbrella. I line those up in my head, and now I ask myself, could I create something interesting? Well, maybe I could create a retractable bag
made out of cellulose fiber. And on it, I'll print the various uses that it could be used for. Now, mind you, I haven't actually checked to see if this bag exists. This is just a thought exercise. So if the product already exists, kudos to you. If you want to start creating this product, you're welcome to create one. Just make sure you give me some credit. But this was just literally something I came up with this morning to show you. Okay, so I've introduced you to choice maps, choice mapping. Let me end with a quote from one of my favorite intellectuals, a guy by the name of Henri Poincaré, a French polymath. And I think he summed up innovation very accurately when he said, innovation consists of the avoiding of the constructing of useless combinations and consists of the constructing of useful combinations, which are an infinite minority. To invent is to discern, to choose. And I believe that the choice map and choice mapping is an operationalization. It simply tells you how to do exactly what Henri Poincaré advised us to do so long ago. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Iyengar. We have a couple of questions for a time capsule, and we are about to open it next year during next forum. So the world as technologies transforms our world very quickly. What kind of scientific invention or new technology could dramatically change our lives, and something that could be implemented next year in 2021?
So I think 2021, the biggest innovation we saw was that mRNA could create a vaccine in less than a year, like 150 days or however many days it was. In 2022, given all the mutations that we're seeing in the virus, you're essentially going to have an even better vaccine, because essentially you can now use AI to diagnose what are all the mutations and all the variations and create your super vaccine. That super vaccine we are going to see in 2022 because the stakes are very high and they're working on it in real time. I believe going forward, that is going to be the methodology we're going to use for creating all kinds of vaccines for all kinds of other diseases. I also think related to the vaccine for COVID, the medications for if you get sick, you go to the pharmacy, and today we buy ABEL or Tylenol. If you get a flu, we're going to go to the pharmacy and get some COVID medicine, which we will take, and it will become just like a flu. I think those are the two biggest innovations I think are going to happen in 2022. And if it doesn't, then I'm sorry I was wrong, but I'm fairly sure this will be it.
We hope that it will be the case. Sheena Iyengar, business professor and management department. Thank you very much. Wish you everything, just good. And hope that we will be able to also talk in future in professional industry to zero. Wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you.